A man who achieved everything society values, yet found himself questioning the very foundations of human existence. Born into Russian aristocracy in 1828, he would become not only one of literature's greatest voices, but also one of philosophy's most radical thinkers. Most people know Tolstoy for War and Peace and Anna Karenina, masterpieces that established him as a literary giant. But beneath the surface of these novels lay a mind wrestling with the deepest questions of human existence, questions that would eventually consume his entire life and transform him from a celebrated artist into a revolutionary philosopher. Tolstoy's philosophical journey began not in the lecture halls of universities, but in the depths of personal crisis. At the height of his fame, when he possessed everything that supposedly brings happiness, wealth, recognition, a loving family, and artistic genius, he found himself standing at the edge of an abyss. The question that haunted him was devastatingly simple, yet impossible to answer through conventional means. If death makes everything ultimately meaningless, if all human achievements crumble into dust, if love itself cannot survive the grave, then what possible significance can life have? This question would drive Tolstoy to construct a philosophical system unlike anything that came before it. His philosophy was not built in ivory towers, but forged in the fire of lived experience, tested against the harsh realities of Russian society, and refined through decades of spiritual struggle. What emerged was a worldview that challenged every assumption of modern civilization, from the nature of art and education to the foundations of government and the meaning of religious faith. Tolstoy's philosophy was revolutionary, not because it offered new theories, but because it demanded that philosophical ideas be lived rather than merely discussed. Unlike the systematic philosophers of his era, Tolstoy approached truth through multiple channels. He was simultaneously a mystic and a rationalist, an anarchist and a Christian, a critic of civilization and a seeker of universal human values. His ideas would eventually influence figures as diverse as Mahatma Gandhi and Ludwig Wittgenstein, Martin Luther King and James Baldwin, shaping movements for social justice, nonviolent resistance and spiritual renewal that continue to this day. To understand Tolstoy's philosophy is to encounter a mind that refused to accept easy answers, a thinker who insisted that the most important questions in life are also the most difficult ones. Part 1. The Great Spiritual Earthquake. The 1870s marked a watershed moment in Tolstoy's life, a period he would later describe as a complete spiritual earthquake that shattered everything he thought he knew about existence. He was 50 years old, at the absolute pinnacle of literary success, with Anna Karenina bringing him international acclaim and financial security beyond imagination. By every external measure, Leo Tolstoy was living a charmed life. He owned vast estates, commanded the respect of intellectuals across Europe, had published novels that would outlive him by centuries, and enjoyed a large, healthy family. Yet beneath this surface of success, something profound and terrifying was stirring. The crisis began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in a foundation that grows wider with each passing day. Tolstoy found himself unable to concentrate on his writing, unable to find pleasure in activities that had once brought him joy. More disturbing still, he began to question not just his own accomplishments, but the entire structure of human civilization. What was the point of writing great novels if the readers would eventually die and forget them? What was the meaning of accumulating wealth if it could not purchase even one additional day of life? Why bring children into a world where suffering and death were the only certainties? These questions might seem like the idle musings of a privileged man with too much time on his hands, But for Tolstoy they became matters of life and death in the most literal sense. He began to contemplate suicide with an intensity that frightened him. He removed ropes from his room and avoided carrying a gun, not trusting himself to resist the temptation to end what seemed like a meaningless existence. The irony was almost unbearable. Here was a man who had spent his career creating meaning through art, now finding himself unable to locate any meaning in existence itself. What made Tolstoy's crisis particularly agonizing was his intellectual honesty. He could not simply ignore these questions or distract himself with pleasure and activity, as many of his contemporaries did. His mind was too sharp, his moral sense too developed, to accept comfortable lies or conventional wisdom. He had always been a seeker of truth, and now that very commitment to truth was leading him into darkness. He tried to find answers in the philosophical and scientific works of his time, reading voraciously through German idealism, French positivism, and British empiricism. But every system he studied seemed to offer the same conclusion, that human life was ultimately without objective meaning or purpose. The turning point came when Tolstoy realized that his crisis was not unique to him, but was actually the hidden condition of his entire social class. The educated, wealthy elite of 19th-century Russia lived lives of elaborate artifice, surrounding themselves with culture, luxury, and philosophical sophistication to avoid confronting the fundamental meaninglessness of their existence. They attended operas and read novels and debated political theories, but none of these activities addressed the core question of why life was worth living. In fact, Tolstoy began to suspect that much of what passed for civilization was actually an elaborate system of distraction, designed to keep people from asking the most important questions. This insight led Tolstoy to one of the most radical realizations of his philosophical journey. He began to understand that the problem was not simply intellectual, but moral and spiritual. The reason that educated people could not find meaning in life was not because no meaning existed, but because they had structured their lives in ways that made meaning impossible to perceive. They had become parasites, living off the labor of others, consuming without producing, thinking without doing, talking about virtue without practicing it. How could such people expect to understand the purpose of existence when they had disconnected themselves from the fundamental realities of human life? How could they find meaning when they had never engaged in meaningful work, never experienced genuine hardship, never been forced to confront their own mortality in practical rather than theoretical terms? This realization would prove to be the foundation stone of Tolstoy's entire philosophical system. The crisis that had nearly driven him to suicide became the catalyst for a complete transformation of his worldview. He began to understand that finding meaning in life was not simply a matter of thinking correctly, but of living correctly, not just of believing the right ideas, but of embodying them in daily practice. The answers he sought could not be found in books or lectures, but only through a fundamental reorientation of his entire existence. This insight would lead him on a spiritual journey that would transform not only his own life, but would eventually influence millions of people around the world who were struggling with the same fundamental questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence. Part 2. The battle between faith and reason. Tolstoy's spiritual crisis forced him to confront one of philosophy's most ancient and persistent questions, the relationship between faith and reason. For most of his adult life he had been a child of the Enlightenment, believing that human reason could ultimately solve all important problems and provide answers to life's deepest questions. He had dismissed religious faith as superstition, suitable perhaps for uneducated peasants, but beneath the dignity of an intellectual. Yet now, when reason had led him to the brink of despair, he found himself wondering whether faith might offer something that rational analysis could not. The breakthrough came when Tolstoy began to observe the lives of ordinary people, particularly the peasants who worked on his estate. These were men and women who possessed little formal education, who could barely read and write, who knew nothing of philosophy or science. Yet they seemed to possess something that all his learning had failed to provide, a deep sense of purpose and meaning that sustained them through hardship and suffering. They did not question whether life was worth living, because they knew, with a certainty that transcended argument, that it was. They faced death without the existential terror that paralyzed educated people like himself. They found joy in simple things, meaning in ordinary work, and hope in the face of tragedy. This observation led Tolstoy to a startling conclusion. Perhaps the problem was not that life lacked meaning, but that rational analysis was fundamentally incapable of grasping the kind of meaning that life actually possessed. Maybe there were truths that could only be apprehended through faith, through a kind of knowing that bypassed the analytical mind entirely. This was not anti-rational exactly, but it suggested that reason had limits, that there were dimensions of reality that lay beyond its reach. Just as the eye cannot see ultraviolet light even though such light exists, perhaps the rational mind could not perceive the spiritual dimensions of existence even though they were real and powerful. Tolstoy began to understand faith not as the acceptance of irrational propositions, but as a different way of engaging with reality. Faith was not about believing impossible things, but about recognizing truths that could not be proven through logical argument. When a mother loves her child, she does not love because she has reasoned herself into it after careful analysis of the child's qualities. Love simply exists, immediately and certainly, as a fundamental fact of her experience. Similarly, when people have faith in the meaningfulness of existence, they are not making a logical error, but recognizing something that transcends logic entirely. They are responding to a truth that can only be known through lived experience rather than abstract thought. This insight revolutionized Tolstoy's understanding of knowledge itself. He came to see that there were essentially two kinds of truth in the world. There was scientific truth, which dealt with measurable, quantifiable aspects of reality and could be verified through experiment and logical analysis. This kind of truth was valuable for understanding how the physical world operated, but it could tell you nothing about why the world existed or what you should do with your life. Then there was spiritual truth, which dealt with questions of meaning, purpose, and moral obligation. This kind of truth could not be proven in a laboratory, but it was no less real for being unprovable. The key insight was that these two types of truth operated in different spheres and served different purposes. Trying to use scientific methods to answer spiritual questions was like trying to measure love with a ruler, or weigh hope on a scale. It was not that love and hope were unreal, but that they belonged to a different category of reality than the things that could be quantified and measured. Similarly, trying to use spiritual intuition to solve scientific problems was equally misguided. Faith could tell you that life had meaning, but it could not tell you how to build a bridge or cure a disease. Each type of knowledge had its proper domain, and confusion arose when people tried to apply one type of thinking to problems that required the other. This reconciliation of faith and reason became central to Tolstoy's mature philosophy. He was not abandoning reason but recognizing its limitations. Reason was an excellent tool for understanding the mechanics of existence, but it was powerless to address questions of ultimate meaning and purpose. For those questions you needed faith, not as a substitute for thinking, but as a complement to it. Faith provided the foundation of meaning upon which rational thought could build, while reason provided the tools for working out the practical implications of faith-based insights. Together they could address the full range of human concerns in a way that neither could manage alone. Part 3. The rejection of organized religion. Having discovered the importance of faith, Tolstoy might have been expected to embrace the Russian Orthodox Church, the dominant religious institution of his culture. Instead, he launched one of the most devastating critiques of organized religion ever written by a Christian believer. Tolstoy's attack on the Church was not motivated by atheism or anti-religious sentiment, but by his conviction that institutional Christianity had betrayed the original message of Jesus Christ. In fact, it was precisely because he took Christian teaching so seriously that he found the Church's practices so appalling. Tolstoy's critique began with a simple observation. There was a profound disconnect between what Jesus actually taught and what the Church practiced. Jesus had preached love for enemies, non-resistance to evil, and radical forgiveness. He had blessed the poor and warned against the dangers of wealth. He had rejected violence and called his followers to be peacemakers. Yet the Church that claimed to represent him blessed wars, accumulated vast riches, and supported political systems that oppressed the poor. The Orthodox Church in Russia was little more than a department of the state, providing religious justification for the Tsar's absolute power and helping to keep the peasants docile and obedient. Even more troubling to Tolstoy was the Church's emphasis on supernatural beliefs rather than ethical practice. The clergy spent endless time debating abstract theological questions about the nature of the Trinity or the mechanics of salvation, while largely ignoring Jesus' clear teachings about how people should treat each other. They insisted that salvation depended on believing the right doctrines and participating in the right rituals, rather than on actually following Christ's example of love and service. This struck Tolstoy as a fundamental perversion of Christianity, transforming a religion of ethics into a religion of magic. Tolstoy was particularly offended by the Church's claims to exclusive access to divine truth. The clergy presented themselves as intermediaries between God and ordinary people, as if the divine could only be reached through their mediation. This contradicted Jesus' teaching that the kingdom of heaven was within each person, accessible to anyone who sought it with sincere heart. Moreover, the Church's insistence that only Christians could be saved seemed to Tolstoy both arrogant and absurd. How could a loving God condemn billions of people simply for being born into the wrong culture or historical period? Such a doctrine made God seem less moral than an ordinary human being. Instead of the institutional Church, Tolstoy proposed a return to what he called primitive Christianity, the original message of Jesus stripped of centuries of theological elaboration and political compromise. This meant focusing on the Sermon on the Mount rather than the creeds, on ethical practice rather than supernatural beliefs. It meant treating Christianity as a way of life rather than a set of propositions to be believed. The essence of Jesus' teaching, as Tolstoy understood it, could be summarized in a few simple principles that any person could understand and follow. First, all human beings were children of the same divine source and therefore brothers and sisters to each other. This meant that violence against another person was always wrong, regardless of the circumstances or justifications offered. Second, love was the fundamental law of existence, and all other moral principles were simply applications of this basic truth. Third, the kingdom of heaven was not a place you went after death, but a way of living in the present moment, characterized by peace, joy, and compassion. Fourth, true religion was not about beliefs or rituals, but about the transformation of character, the gradual replacement of selfishness with love. These principles were revolutionary in their simplicity and in their implications for how society should be organized. Tolstoy's religious views inevitably brought him into conflict with the Orthodox Church hierarchy. His writings were banned by the censors, and in 1901 he was formally excommunicated. The Church denounced him as a heretic and a dangerous influence on the faithful, but Tolstoy was undaunted by this opposition. He believed that institutional Christianity had already excommunicated itself from the true spirit of Christ through its compromises with worldly power. The Church's rejection of him only confirmed his conviction that it had lost touch with the very message it claimed to represent. For Tolstoy, being cast out by such an institution was not a punishment but a liberation, freeing him to pursue authentic Christianity without the constraints of ecclesiastical politics and theological orthodoxy. Part 4. The Philosophy of Absolute Nonviolence. Perhaps no aspect of Tolstoy's philosophy was more radical or influential than his doctrine of absolute nonviolence. This was not merely a political strategy or a personal preference, but a fundamental principle that he believed lay at the heart of moral existence. For Tolstoy, the rejection of violence was not optional for anyone who claimed to be serious about ethics or spirituality. It was the inevitable conclusion that followed from taking the idea of human equality seriously. Tolstoy's commitment to non-violence grew directly out of his understanding of Jesus' teachings, particularly the command to love your enemies and turn the other cheek. Most Christians had interpreted these passages as counsel for personal relationships, not as principles for organizing society. But Tolstoy insisted that Jesus meant exactly what he said. If violence was wrong in personal relationships, how could it suddenly become right when practiced by governments or in the name of justice? If it was wrong to strike someone who insulted you, how could it be right to kill someone because a political leader declared them an enemy? Tolstoy saw no meaningful distinction between personal violence and institutional violence. The philosophical foundation of Tolstoy's pacifism was his belief in the fundamental equality of all human beings. Every person, regardless of their nationality, religion, social class or moral character, possessed the same divine spark that made them infinitely valuable. This meant that no one had the right to take another person's life, no matter what that person had done or might do. Violence was not just harmful to the victim but corrupting to the perpetrator, because it required you to deny the humanity of another person. Each act of violence made the world a little more brutal and made future violence more likely. Conversely, each act of non-violent resistance made the world a little more humane and demonstrated the possibility of resolving conflicts without destruction. Tolstoy was particularly critical of what he called legal violence, the brutality practiced by governments in the name of law and order. When a criminal committed murder, everyone recognized it as wrong. But when the state executed that same criminal, it was praised as justice. Tolstoy could see no moral difference between the two acts. Both involved the deliberate taking of human life, and both were based on the premise that some people deserved to die. In fact, he argued that state violence was worse than criminal violence because it claimed moral authority and corrupted the entire society. When governments practiced violence, they taught citizens that brutality was acceptable when practiced by the right people for the right reasons. This inevitably led to more violence throughout society, as people learned to justify their own brutality by appealing to higher purposes. The same logic applied to war, which Tolstoy saw as the ultimate expression of collective insanity. Nations would mobilize millions of young men to kill each other over disputes that could have been resolved through negotiation and compromise. Governments would spend vast resources on weapons while their own people lacked food, housing and education. They would invoke God's blessing on their armies while teaching their soldiers to commit acts that would be considered murder in any other context. Most absurdly of all, both sides in every war claimed to be fighting for justice and righteousness, as if the same God could simultaneously bless contradictory causes. Tolstoy concluded that war was nothing more than mass murder disguised as patriotism, a way for rulers to sacrifice their subjects for personal ambition while avoiding the risks themselves. But Tolstoy's non-violence was not passive or weak. He distinguished sharply between non-resistance to evil and non-cooperation with evil. True non-violence required tremendous courage and moral strength, because it meant being willing to suffer rather than inflict suffering on others. It meant refusing to participate in unjust systems, even when such refusal carried severe personal costs. It meant speaking truth to power, even when truth was unwelcome and dangerous. Most importantly, it meant taking personal responsibility for creating the kind of world you wanted to live in, rather than waiting for others to change first. Tolstoy believed that non-violent resistance was actually more effective than violence in creating lasting social change. Violence might achieve temporary victories, but it always generated counter-violence that perpetuated cycles of conflict. Non-violence, by contrast, could actually transform opponents rather than simply defeating them. When people practiced genuine love toward their enemies, it often awakened the conscience of those enemies and created the possibility of genuine reconciliation. This was not naive optimism, but a hard-earned insight based on Tolstoy's observation of how moral force operated in human relationships. The power of non-violence lay not in its ability to compel obedience, but in its capacity to inspire voluntary transformation. Part 5. Christian Anarchism and the Rejection of the State. Tolstoy's commitment to non-violence led him inevitably to anarchism, the belief that all forms of government were inherently illegitimate. This was not the anarchism of bombs and revolutionary violence, but a principled rejection of coercive authority based on Christian ethics. For Tolstoy, the state was simply organized violence on a massive scale, and no Christian could in good conscience participate in or support such an institution. This position put him at odds not only with conservative defenders of the existing order, but also with liberal reformers and revolutionary socialists who believed that political action could create a more just society. Tolstoy's critique of the state began with a simple observation about the nature of government power. All political authority ultimately rested on the threat of violence. Laws were not suggestions, but commands backed by the promise of punishment for those who disobeyed. Police existed to arrest those who violated state edicts. Armies existed to defend the state against external enemies and internal rebellions. Courts existed to determine how much violence should be applied to those who challenged state authority. Even the most democratic and benevolent government was still fundamentally an organization designed to compel obedience through the use or threat of force. For someone committed to absolute non-violence, cooperation with such an institution was impossible. But Tolstoy's anarchism went deeper than a simple rejection of government violence. He argued that the state was inherently corrupting to human nature because it concentrated power in the hands of a few individuals while teaching the masses to be obedient and passive. Political systems, whether monarchical or democratic, created artificial hierarchies that contradicted the fundamental equality of all human beings. They encouraged people to look to external authorities for guidance rather than developing their own moral judgment. They fostered nationalism and tribalism by teaching people to see themselves as members of competing groups rather than as part of a universal human family. Most perniciously, they created the illusion that social problems could be solved through legislation and enforcement rather than through individual moral transformation. Tolstoy was particularly critical of democracy, which many of his contemporaries saw as the solution to the problems of autocratic government. He argued that democracy was simply a more sophisticated form of tyranny, one that gave people the illusion of self-governance while keeping real power in the hands of political and economic elites. When people voted, they were not exercising meaningful control over their lives, but merely choosing which set of rulers would govern them for the next few years. The fundamental relationship remained the same, a small group of people making decisions that affected millions of others who had no real say in the matter. Moreover, democracy encouraged people to think that they could escape moral responsibility by delegating it to elected representatives. Instead of taking personal action to address social problems, they simply voted for politicians who promised to solve those problems through government programs. The alternative that Tolstoy proposed was not chaos, but a form of voluntary organization based on moral principles rather than coercive power. He envisioned communities of people who cooperated with each other not because they were forced to do so, but because they recognized their mutual dependence and shared humanity. Such communities would not need external authority because their members would govern themselves according to the law of love. Conflicts would be resolved through discussion and moral suasion rather than through punishment and force. People would contribute to the common good not because they were compelled to do so, but because they understood that their own welfare was inseparable from the welfare of others. This was not utopian dreaming, but a practical vision of how human society could be organized if people took seriously the ethical teachings of Jesus. Tolstoy recognized that such a transformation of society could not happen overnight or through political revolution. It required a gradual change in human consciousness, a growing recognition that cooperation was more rational than competition, and that love was more powerful than force. This change had to begin with individuals who were willing to live according to these principles, even when surrounded by a society that rejected them. Each person who refused to participate in violence, who treated others with genuine compassion, who took responsibility for their own moral development, was contributing to the eventual transformation of the entire human community. The kingdom of heaven was not a place but a way of living, and it would come into existence when enough people chose to embody its principles in their daily lives. This was slow work, requiring patience and persistence, but Tolstoy believed it was the only way to create lasting social change. Part 6. Art as Moral Communication. Tolstoy's aesthetic philosophy, developed most fully in his 1897 treatise What is Art, represented one of the most radical rejections of conventional artistic values ever articulated. At a time when most intellectuals celebrated art for art's sake and viewed aesthetic experience as valuable in itself, Tolstoy insisted that art had no legitimacy unless it served moral and spiritual purposes. This was not the position of a Philistine who failed to appreciate beauty, but the carefully reasoned conclusion of someone who understood the immense power of artistic expression and believed that such power carried corresponding responsibilities. Tolstoy's theory began with a fundamental redefinition of what art actually was. Instead of defining art in terms of beauty or aesthetic pleasure, he argued that art was essentially a form of communication, a way of transmitting feelings and experiences from one person to another. When an artist created a genuine work of art, they were not trying to make something beautiful, but to share an emotional experience that they had lived through themselves. The painting, poem, or musical composition was simply the medium through which this transmission occurred. If the work succeeded in making the audience feel what the artist had felt, then it was good art, regardless of whether it conformed to traditional standards of beauty. If it failed to create this emotional connection, then it was not really art at all, no matter how technically accomplished or aesthetically pleasing it might be. This communicative theory of art had radical implications for how artistic value should be determined. Tolstoy argued that the worth of an artwork depended on three factors: the genuineness of the emotion being expressed, the importance of that emotion for human life, and the clarity with which it was communicated. Genuine emotion meant that the artist had actually experienced the feeling they were trying to convey, rather than simply manufacturing it for effect. Important emotion meant feelings that contributed to human solidarity and moral development, rather than those that promoted selfishness or vice. Clear communication meant that the artwork could be understood by ordinary people without special education or cultural initiation. Art that failed on any of these criteria was, in Tolstoy's view, false art that served no legitimate purpose. Applying these standards, Tolstoy reached conclusions that shocked the artistic establishment of his time. He dismissed much of what was considered high culture, including works by Shakespeare, Wagner, and even his own novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina, as false art created for the entertainment of the privileged classes. These works might be technically sophisticated and emotionally powerful, but they communicated feelings and values that were accessible only to educated elites, and that often promoted immoral attitudes. Shakespeare's plays, for example, glorified violence and revenge while treating the suffering of common people as comic relief. Wagner's operas celebrated pagan mythology and aristocratic values that contradicted Christian ethics. Even Tolstoy's own great novels, he came to believe, were too complex and culturally specific to reach ordinary readers and dealt with the problems of the wealthy, rather than addressing universal human concerns. By contrast, Tolstoy praised simple folk songs, religious hymns, and stories that conveyed universal feelings of love, compassion, and solidarity. He valued children's literature and peasant art because they spoke directly to basic human emotions without requiring sophisticated interpretation. He admired the biblical parables because they used simple narratives to communicate profound spiritual truths that anyone could understand. These works might not display the technical virtuosity that critics valued, but they succeeded in the most important task of art, creating emotional connections between human beings and promoting moral development. Tolstoy's aesthetic theory was closely connected to his social and political philosophy. He argued that the art of his time had become corrupted because it served the interests of a parasitic leisure class, rather than addressing the needs of humanity as a whole. Wealthy patrons commissioned works that flattered their vanity and confirmed their prejudices, while artists competed to create increasingly exotic and artificial productions that demonstrated their cleverness rather than their humanity. This system not only produced bad art, but also diverted enormous resources from meeting basic human needs. The money spent on a single opera production could feed hundreds of hungry families. Yet society praised artistic extravagance while ignoring widespread poverty. True art, Tolstoy believed, would emerge only when artists committed themselves to serving universal human values rather than the tastes of cultural elites. The ultimate purpose of art, in Tolstoy's view, was to contribute to the moral evolution of humanity. By sharing authentic experiences of love, compassion, and spiritual insight, artists could help people understand their common humanity and develop their capacity for empathy. Art could break down the barriers of class, nationality, and culture that divided human beings from each other. It could inspire people to live more ethically and to work for the creation of a more just and peaceful world. But this could only happen if artists themselves were committed to moral development and if they created works that spoke to the universal elements of human experience rather than to the particular interests of any single group. Art had the power to transform society, but only if it first transformed the hearts and minds of those who created and experienced it. Part 7. Education and Human Development. Tolstoy's approach to education was as revolutionary as his views on art and politics, based on the radical premise that children were naturally good and naturally curious, and that traditional schooling often did more harm than good. His educational philosophy grew out of his own experiences as a teacher at the school he established on his estate, where he experimented with methods that respected children's inherent dignity and learning capacity. These experiments convinced him that most educational problems stemmed not from children's deficiencies, but from adults' misunderstanding of how learning actually occurred. The foundation of Tolstoy's educational philosophy was his belief that every child possessed an innate desire to learn and grow. Children were naturally curious about the world around them and naturally motivated to develop their capabilities. They did not need to be forced to learn, but only needed to be provided with appropriate opportunities and guidance. Traditional education, with its emphasis on external rewards and punishments, actually corrupted this natural learning drive by teaching children to work for approval, rather than for the intrinsic satisfaction of understanding. Students learned to give teachers the answers they wanted to hear, rather than to think for themselves. They became passive recipients of information, rather than active explorers of knowledge. Tolstoy argued that the purpose of education should not be to stuff children's minds with facts and skills that adults thought they should know, but to help them develop their own capacity for thinking, feeling, and moral judgment. Each child was a unique individual with their own interests, talents, and developmental timeline. Education should adapt to the child rather than forcing the child to adapt to predetermined curriculum and schedules. This meant allowing children considerable freedom to choose what they studied and how they approached their learning. It meant treating children as partners in the educational process rather than as objects to be moulded by adult authority. Most importantly, it meant recognizing that children often understood things that adults had forgotten or lost sight of. In his school at Yasnaya Polyana, Tolstoy put these principles into practice with remarkable results. There were no grades, no punishments, no forced attendance, and no rigid curriculum. Children came to school when they wanted to learn, and left when they had other things to do. They chose their own subjects of study and worked at their own pace. Teachers served as resources and guides rather than as authorities who imposed their will on students. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, more like a family than an institution. Yet the children in this school learned faster and more thoroughly than students in traditional schools, precisely because they were genuinely engaged with their studies rather than merely going through the motions of compliance. Tolstoy's educational experiments taught him important lessons about the relationship between freedom and responsibility. When children were given genuine freedom to make choices about their learning, they generally made good choices. They might spend a day playing instead of studying, but they would return to their books when they felt ready to learn. They might ignore subjects that adults thought important, but they would pursue areas of genuine interest with an intensity that far exceeded what could be achieved through external compulsion. Most importantly, they developed the capacity for self-direction and personal responsibility that traditional education failed to cultivate. Students who learned in freedom became adults who could think for themselves and make independent moral judgments. But Tolstoy's educational philosophy extended far beyond questions of pedagogy to encompass fundamental questions about the purpose of human development. He believed that the goal of education should be to help people become more fully human, more capable of love, compassion, and wisdom. This required not just intellectual development, but emotional and spiritual growth as well. Children needed to learn not just how to read and write and calculate, but how to live in harmony with others and how to find meaning and purpose in their existence. They needed to develop their capacity for moral reasoning and their sensitivity to beauty and truth. Most importantly, they needed to understand their connection to the larger human community and their responsibility to contribute to the common good. Tolstoy was particularly critical of education that prepared children for roles in an unjust social system. Schools that taught children to be obedient to authority, to compete with each other for scarce rewards, and to value material success above moral development were not truly educating but indoctrinating. They were perpetuating the very problems that made society dysfunctional in the first place. True education should prepare children to transform society rather than simply to succeed within its existing structures. It should give them the knowledge, skills, and moral foundation they needed to create a more just and peaceful world. This was not political indoctrination, but the natural result of helping children develop their full human potential in an environment of freedom, respect, and love. Part 8. The Economics of Justice. Tolstoy's economic philosophy was built on a foundation of moral outrage at the extreme inequality he witnessed in 19th-century Russia. He saw vast estates worked by impoverished peasants, wealthy nobles who had never done a day of productive labour in their lives, and an economic system that seemed designed to transfer wealth from those who worked to those who owned. This was not merely an unfortunate side effect of economic development, but a fundamental injustice that corrupted both the rich and the poor and prevented society from achieving its moral potential. The centerpiece of Tolstoy's economic thinking was his embrace of Georgism, the economic philosophy developed by American economist Henry George. George had argued that the root of economic inequality lay in private ownership of land, which allowed landowners to collect rent from others simply by virtue of owning what nature had provided freely. Since land was not created by human labour, no individual had a legitimate claim to exclusive ownership of it. The earth belonged to all humanity in common, and any system that allowed some people to monopolize land while others were excluded was inherently unjust. Tolstoy found this argument completely convincing, and spent his later years trying to live according to its implications. He attempted to give away his land to the peasants who worked it, though legal and family complications made this more difficult than he had anticipated. But Tolstoy's economic philosophy went far beyond questions of land ownership to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of work and wealth. He argued that there was a crucial distinction between productive labour, which created real value, and parasitic income, which extracted wealth created by others. Farmers who grew food, craftsmen who made useful objects, and teachers who shared knowledge were contributing to human welfare and deserved to be compensated for their efforts. But landlords who collected rent, capitalists who lived off investment income, and aristocrats who inherited wealth without working for it were essentially thieves, taking what others had produced without giving anything in return. A just economic system would reward productive contribution while eliminating parasitic extraction. This would not only reduce inequality, but would also free human energy and creativity for genuinely beneficial activities. Tolstoy's critique of capitalism was particularly sharp because he saw it as a system that institutionalized and legitimized theft. Under feudalism, at least the extraction of wealth by the noble class was honest about its basis in force and tradition. But capitalism disguised exploitation as voluntary exchange, making it seem as if workers freely chose to sell their labour for wages that allowed them to survive while their employers accumulated vast fortunes. In reality, workers had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered because the alternative was starvation. The owners of capital could dictate terms because they controlled access to the means of production. This was not freedom, but a more sophisticated form of slavery, one that maintained the appearance of choice while ensuring that the fundamental power relationship remained unchanged. Tolstoy was equally critical of socialism, which he saw as an attempt to solve the problems of capitalism by making the state the universal capitalist. Transferring ownership from private individuals to government bureaucrats did not address the fundamental problem of some people living off the labour of others. It simply changed who got to be the parasite. Moreover, socialism required the use of state violence to implement and maintain, which contradicted Tolstoy's commitment to non-violence. Any system that had to be imposed by force was inherently illegitimate, regardless of how just its stated goals might be. True economic justice could only emerge from voluntary cooperation based on moral principles rather than from coercive redistribution enforced by political authority. The economic system that Tolstoy envisioned was based on the principle that everyone should contribute productive labour and everyone should share in the results of that labour. There would be no distinction between owners and workers because everyone would be both. People would work not because they were forced to do so, but because they understood that their own welfare depended on contributing to the common good. They would share resources not because they were compelled to do so, but because they recognized their fundamental interdependence. Such a system would not require external enforcement, because it would be based on mutual understanding and voluntary cooperation. It would be economically efficient because it would eliminate the waste associated with parasitic extraction and would harness everyone's productive potential. Most importantly, it would be morally just because it would reward contribution rather than exploitation and would recognize the equal dignity and worth of all human beings. Part 9. The Philosophy of Simple Living. Central to Tolstoy's entire worldview was the conviction that modern civilization had become dangerously disconnected from the basic realities of human existence. People in advanced societies surrounded themselves with artificial comforts and complex technologies that made them forget their dependence on the natural world and on each other. They pursued luxuries and status symbols that contributed nothing to genuine human welfare, while requiring enormous amounts of energy and resources to produce and maintain. Most perniciously, this artificial complexity created a class system in which some people lived lives of idle consumption while others laboured to support them. Tolstoy's advocacy of simple living was not motivated by ascetic hatred of pleasure or romantic nostalgia for the past, but by a careful analysis of what actually contributed to human happiness and moral development. He had lived at the pinnacle of luxury and sophistication, with access to the finest arts, foods, and material comforts that money could buy. Yet he had discovered that these things not only failed to bring happiness, but actually interfered with it by creating artificial needs and fostering competitive materialism. The more possessions people accumulated, the more time and energy they had to devote to maintaining and protecting those possessions. The more they defined themselves by what they owned rather than by who they were, the more anxious and insecure they became. Luxury was not just morally corrupting, but practically counterproductive, creating problems faster than it solved them. Simple living, by contrast, offered both practical and spiritual benefits. When people reduced their material needs to the essentials, they freed themselves from the endless cycle of earning and spending that consumed so much of modern life. They could devote more time to relationships, to creative pursuits, to moral and spiritual development, and to activities that brought genuine satisfaction rather than temporary pleasure. They could also reduce their dependence on systems of exploitation by learning to provide for their own basic needs rather than relying on the labour of others. Most importantly, they could develop a more authentic relationship with the natural world by experiencing directly the sources of food, shelter and clothing rather than treating these necessities as commodities that appeared magically in stores. Simple living was not about deprivation, but about distinguishing between genuine needs and artificial wants. Tolstoy practiced what he preached, much to the dismay of his family and social circle. He gave up his aristocratic lifestyle to live like a peasant, wearing simple clothes, eating plain food, and doing manual labour alongside the workers on his estate. He learned to cobble shoes and to work in the fields, not as a hobby or symbolic gesture, but as a way of connecting with the fundamental activities that sustained human life. This was not always easy or comfortable, and it created considerable tension with his wife, who had not chosen to abandon the lifestyle into which she had been born. But Tolstoy found that physical work brought him a satisfaction and sense of purpose that intellectual activity alone could not provide. There was something deeply fulfilling about creating useful things with his own hands and about contributing directly to meeting human needs rather than simply manipulating symbols and ideas. The philosophy of simple living was closely connected to Tolstoy's broader critique of modern civilization. He argued that technological progress had created a situation in which human beings were increasingly alienated from the sources of their own survival. City dwellers had no idea where their food came from or how their clothes were made. They lived in artificial environments that insulated them from natural cycles and seasonal changes. They worked at abstract jobs that seemed to have no connection to meeting basic human needs. This alienation made them vulnerable to manipulation by those who controlled the complex systems on which they depended. It also made them forget their kinship with the rest of the natural world and their responsibility to live in harmony with ecological limits. Simple living was not just a personal choice, but a form of resistance to this alienating system. Tolstoy recognized that not everyone could or should live exactly as he did, but he believed that everyone could and should simplify their lives to some degree. This might mean growing some of their own food, making some of their own clothes, or learning practical skills that reduce their dependence on commercial systems. It might mean choosing quality over quantity, buying fewer things, but ensuring that those things were well made and ethically produced. It might mean spending less time pursuing material advancement and more time developing relationships and personal growth. The specific details mattered less than the underlying principle of distinguishing between genuine needs and artificial wants, and of taking personal responsibility for the consequences of one's lifestyle choices. Simple living was ultimately about freedom, the freedom that came from not being enslaved by possessions, status, anxiety, or artificial needs. Part 10. The Critique of Modern Civilization. Tolstoy's analysis of modern civilization was comprehensive and devastating, encompassing everything from technology and urbanization to science and progress itself. He saw the modern world as a vast machine designed to separate human beings from each other and from the natural sources of life, creating artificial needs and dependencies that made genuine freedom and happiness impossible. This was not the perspective of someone who had never experienced modernity's benefits, but the hard-won insight of someone who had lived at its very centre and found it spiritually bankrupt. At the heart of Tolstoy's critique was his observation that modern civilization created a fundamental split between how people lived and what they claimed to believe. The same society that professed Christian values of love and brotherhood organized itself around competition and exploitation. The same culture that celebrated human dignity and equality maintained systems that condemned millions of people to poverty and ignorance. The same civilization that claimed to pursue truth and knowledge used that knowledge primarily to develop more efficient ways of killing people and exploiting natural resources. This contradiction was not accidental but structural, built into the very foundations of modern society. The pursuit of material progress inevitably came into conflict with moral and spiritual development, and modern civilization had consistently chosen material advancement while abandoning its stated ethical commitments. Tolstoy was particularly critical of the cult of scientific progress that dominated intellectual life in his era. He did not oppose science itself, which he recognized as a valuable tool for understanding certain aspects of reality. But he was deeply skeptical of the belief that scientific and technological advancement automatically led to human improvement. The same scientific knowledge that could cure diseases could also create new weapons of mass destruction. The same technological capabilities that could improve communication and transportation could also be used for surveillance and control. Science was morally neutral, equally capable of serving good or evil purposes depending on how it was applied. Yet modern society had developed an almost religious faith in scientific progress, assuming that any advance in knowledge or capability was automatically beneficial, regardless of its moral implications. This faith in progress was particularly dangerous because it encouraged people to abdicate their moral responsibility. Instead of asking whether particular developments were actually good for human beings, people simply assumed that change meant improvement and that newer was always better. They became passive consumers of whatever innovations were offered to them, regardless of the social or environmental costs. They lost the capacity to evaluate technological developments critically, or to reject those that were harmful. Most importantly, they began to measure human worth by external standards of efficiency and productivity, rather than by internal standards of character and wisdom. This led to a society that was increasingly sophisticated in its means, but increasingly confused about its ends. Tolstoy also saw modern urbanization as profoundly destructive to human nature. Cities concentrated large numbers of people in artificial environments that bore no resemblance to the natural settings in which human beings had evolved. Urban dwellers became dependent on complex systems for meeting their most basic needs, losing the skills and knowledge that had once made them self-sufficient. They were surrounded by strangers rather than by extended families and stable communities, leading to isolation and alienation despite being constantly surrounded by other people. They were exposed to constant noise, pollution and overstimulation that made quiet reflection and spiritual development difficult, if not impossible. Most importantly, they lost contact with natural cycles and seasonal rhythms, forgetting their place in the larger web of life. The alternative that Tolstoy proposed was not a return to some imagined golden age, but a conscious choice to organize society around human needs rather than technological capabilities. This would mean prioritizing simplicity over complexity, community over individualism, and moral development over material accumulation. It would mean using technology selectively, adopting only those innovations that actually improved human welfare, while rejecting those that created new problems or dependencies. It would mean designing cities and institutions to support human flourishing rather than economic efficiency. Most importantly, it would mean recovering the wisdom that modern civilization had lost in its rush toward progress. The understanding that human beings were part of nature rather than its masters, and that true advancement meant becoming more fully human rather than more efficiently productive. This transformation could not be imposed from above, but had to begin with individuals who chose to live according to these principles, even when surrounded by a society that rejected them. Part 11. Death and the Meaning of Life. Perhaps no aspect of Tolstoy's philosophy was more profound or personally urgent than his confrontation with mortality and its implications for human existence. His spiritual crisis had been triggered by the sudden overwhelming awareness that death made everything seem meaningless, that all human achievements and relationships were temporary and would eventually be forgotten. Yet through his philosophical journey, he came to develop a radically different understanding of death's role in human life, one that transformed terror into acceptance and meaninglessness into purpose. Tolstoy's early horror of death had been based on his identification of himself with his physical body and his individual personality. From this perspective, death was indeed the ultimate catastrophe, the complete annihilation of everything that made him who he was. All his thoughts, memories, relationships, and accomplishments would simply cease to exist when his brain stopped functioning. This was the materialist view of human nature that dominated educated thinking in his time, and it led inevitably to existential despair. If human beings were nothing more than complex biological machines, then death was simply the breakdown of the machinery, and life was merely a brief interval between two eternities of non-existence. From such a perspective, nothing could have ultimate significance because everything was doomed to disappear. But Tolstoy's exploration of faith and spirituality led him to a fundamentally different understanding of human nature. He came to believe that the essential self was not the physical body or even the individual personality, but something deeper and more enduring. This true self was not separate from other people, but was part of a universal consciousness or divine life that connected all beings. Death was not the destruction of this true self, but simply its liberation from the limitations of individual existence. Just as a wave does not cease to exist when it returns to the ocean, but simply loses its temporary individual form, the human soul did not die, but returned to the universal source from which it had emerged. This was not personal immortality in the conventional sense, but something even more profound, participation in eternal life itself. This shift in perspective completely transformed Tolstoy's understanding of how life should be lived. If the goal was to preserve individual existence for as long as possible, then death was indeed the enemy, and life was a desperate struggle against inevitable defeat. But if the goal was to align oneself with the eternal principles that transcended individual existence, then death became relatively unimportant. What mattered was not how long you lived, but how well you lived, not what you accomplished for yourself, but what you contributed to the universal good. From this perspective, a life devoted to love, truth and service was meaningful regardless of how long it lasted, while a life devoted to selfish pursuit was meaningless regardless of how many years it continued. Death was still a reality to be faced, but it was no longer a source of ultimate terror because the most important part of existence transcended mortality altogether. Tolstoy's mature philosophy of death was closely connected to his understanding of moral obligation. If human beings were part of a larger whole, then their primary responsibility was to contribute to the welfare of that whole, rather than to pursue their own narrow interests. Each person had a unique role to play in the cosmic drama, a specific contribution to make to the ongoing evolution of consciousness and love in the universe. Fulfilling this role gave life meaning and purpose that did not depend on personal survival. In fact, attachment to individual existence actually interfered with fulfilling one's true purpose because it led to selfishness and fear. The person who was willing to sacrifice personal interests for universal good was paradoxically the one who achieved the closest thing possible to genuine immortality, living on through the positive influence they had on others and through their contribution to the eternal values that transcended time. This understanding of death and meaning had practical implications for how Tolstoy approached daily life. He tried to live each day as if it might be his last, not in the sense of pursuing immediate pleasure, but in the sense of focusing on what was truly important. He sought to resolve conflicts, express love, and contribute to others' welfare, rather than postponing these activities until some future time that might never come. He tried to reduce his attachment to possessions, status and achievements that would disappear at death, while strengthening his commitment to principles and relationships that had enduring significance. Most importantly, he sought to develop the spiritual qualities that connected him to eternal life, compassion, wisdom and selfless service. Death remained a mystery that could not be fully understood through rational analysis, but it was no longer a source of paralyzing fear, because he had found sources of meaning that transcended mortality. Part 12. Love as the Universal Law. At the center of Tolstoy's entire philosophical system was the conviction that love was not merely one human emotion among others, but the fundamental law that governed all existence. This was not sentimental romanticism, but a carefully reasoned conclusion based on his observation of how the universe actually operated. Everything in nature was interconnected and interdependent, from the smallest biological processes to the largest cosmic structures. What appeared to be separate entities were actually parts of larger wholes, and the health of any part depended on its proper relationship to the whole. Love was simply the recognition of this fundamental unity, and the commitment to act in harmony with it rather than in opposition to it. Tolstoy's understanding of love went far beyond personal relationships to encompass all forms of genuine connection and care. When a mother cared for her child, when friends supported each other through difficulty, when strangers helped each other in times of need, they were expressing the same universal principle that kept planets in their orbits and cells functioning in harmony within organisms. Love was the force that created order out of chaos, meaning out of randomness, and beauty out of mere matter. It was what made consciousness possible, and what drove the evolution of ever greater complexity and awareness throughout the cosmos. To live in accordance with love was to align oneself with the deepest currents of reality itself. To oppose love was to fight against the fundamental structure of existence, a battle that could only end in frustration and defeat. This cosmic understanding of love had profound implications for ethics and social organization. Traditional morality often seemed arbitrary or culturally relative, a set of rules imposed by authority rather than discovered through reason. But if love was truly the fundamental law of existence, then moral principles were not arbitrary, but were discoveries about how reality actually worked. Actions that increased love, compassion, and unity were not just nice, but were actually in harmony with the structure of the universe. Actions that promoted hatred, selfishness, and division were not just mean, but were violations of cosmic law that would inevitably produce negative consequences. Ethics was not a matter of obeying external commands, but of learning to live in harmony with the deepest truths about existence. Tolstoy was particularly fascinated by Jesus' command to love one's enemies, which seemed to most people like an impossible and even foolish requirement. But he came to see this as perhaps the most profound insight ever articulated about the nature of reality. Enemies were simply people who had become confused about their true relationship to others and to the universe as a whole. They acted destructively not because they were inherently evil, but because they had lost sight of the fundamental unity that connected all beings. Responding to their hostility with more hostility only deepened their confusion and perpetuated cycles of conflict. But responding with love could potentially awaken their recognition of the unity they had forgotten, transforming enemies into friends and conflict into cooperation. This was not naive optimism, but practical wisdom based on understanding how consciousness actually changed and developed. The practice of universal love required tremendous courage and spiritual development. It was easy to love people who were kind to you and shared your values and interests. It was much more difficult to love those who opposed you, misunderstood you, or actively tried to harm you. But this was precisely where love proved its power and authenticity. Anyone could be pleasant when things were going well, but only someone who had truly understood the universal nature of love could maintain compassion in the face of hostility and hatred. This kind of love required the death of the ego, the false self that insisted on defending its own narrow interests, even when doing so created suffering for others. It required the birth of a larger identity that embraced all beings as part of oneself. This transformation was not something that could be achieved through willpower alone, but required grace, the spontaneous recognition of unity that came when the barriers created by fear and selfishness finally dissolved. Tolstoy believed that the gradual spread of universal love was the ultimate purpose of human evolution and the key to solving all social problems. Wars occurred because people identified with their nations rather than with humanity as a whole. Economic exploitation occurred because people prioritized their own material welfare over the welfare of others. Environmental destruction occurred because people saw nature as separate from themselves rather than as their extended body. All these problems would disappear naturally when people truly understood their fundamental interconnectedness and learned to love the whole as much as they currently loved the parts they identified with. This transformation could not be forced or legislated, but had to arise spontaneously from growing spiritual awareness. Each person who learned to love more fully was contributing to the eventual transformation of the entire human community, and ultimately to the realization of heaven on earth. Part 13. The Philosophy of History. Tolstoy's understanding of historical change was as revolutionary as his views on individual morality, challenging the dominant belief that great events were shaped by the decisions of powerful leaders and political elites. His massive novel, War and Peace, was not just a story about the Napoleonic era, but a philosophical argument about how history actually worked. An argument that had profound implications for how people should think about social change and their own role in shaping the future. Through his careful study of historical documents and his deep reflection on the nature of human action, Tolstoy developed a theory of history that emphasized the power of ordinary people and the importance of moral rather than political factors in determining the course of events. The conventional view of history in Tolstoy's time focused almost exclusively on the actions of kings, generals, and political leaders, as if the fate of entire nations depended on the personal decisions of a few powerful individuals. Napoleon was credited with conquering Europe through his military genius, while the resistance to his invasion was attributed to the strategic brilliance of opposing commanders. This great man theory of history was appealing because it made complex events seem comprehensible and gave people the illusion that they could understand and control historical change by studying the lives and decisions of important figures. But Tolstoy found this explanation completely unconvincing when he examined the actual evidence. When Tolstoy studied the details of historical events, he discovered that the supposed great men of history were often as confused and powerless as everyone else. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was not the result of careful planning and strategic genius, but a series of miscalculations and reactions to circumstances beyond his control. The Russian resistance was not orchestrated by brilliant generals, but emerged spontaneously from the actions of millions of ordinary people who simply refused to submit to foreign domination. The outcome of battles depended less on the commands of officers than on the courage and initiative of common soldiers who had to make split-second decisions in the chaos of combat. History was not the work of great individuals, but the collective result of countless small actions by ordinary people responding to their immediate circumstances. The so-called leaders were often simply people who happened to be in positions where their personal decisions became visible, while the real forces shaping events operated at a much deeper level. This insight led Tolstoy to develop what might be called a democratic theory of historical change. Real power lay not with political authorities, but with the mass of ordinary people whose daily choices and actions created the conditions within which political events occurred. When a society was morally healthy, with people committed to truth, justice and mutual care, it could resist external threats and internal corruption, regardless of the quality of its official leadership. When a society was morally corrupt, with people focused on selfish interests and material gain, it would be vulnerable to conquest and collapse, no matter how brilliant its rulers might be. History was essentially the working out of moral forces on a massive scale, the gradual triumph of love over hatred, truth over falsehood, and justice over oppression. This process could not be controlled by any individual or group, but could only be influenced by the cumulative effect of millions of people choosing to live according to higher principles. Tolstoy's philosophy of history was closely connected to his religious beliefs and his understanding of divine providence. He believed that there was a moral structure to the universe that ultimately ensured that good would triumph over evil, even though this triumph might take centuries or millennia to achieve. Individual events might seem random or unjust, but the overall direction of history was toward greater freedom, equality, and brotherhood. This was not because of any mechanical law of progress, but because consciousness naturally evolved toward higher levels of understanding and compassion when it was not distorted by false beliefs and corrupt institutions. People naturally wanted to live in harmony with each other and with the divine source of existence. Conflict and suffering arose when this natural tendency was blocked by ignorance, fear, and selfish ambition. As these obstacles were gradually overcome through education and spiritual development, society would naturally evolve toward greater justice and peace. This understanding of history had important implications for how people should approach social and political action. Since real change came from the bottom up rather than from the top down, the most effective way to influence history was not to seek political power, but to focus on personal moral development and to help others do the same. Each person who learned to live according to higher principles was contributing to the eventual transformation of the entire society. Each person who chose love over hatred, truth over falsehood, and service over selfishness was helping to create the conditions within which positive political change could occur. This work was slow and often invisible, but it was more powerful in the long run than any political revolution or military conquest. History was ultimately the story of consciousness evolving toward ever greater awareness of unity and love, and each individual had a crucial role to play in this cosmic drama. Part 14. Social Justice and Class Critique. Tolstoy's analysis of social inequality was not that of a detached observer, but of someone who had lived at the very pinnacle of privilege and had come to understand the profound moral corruption that such privilege entailed. As a member of the Russian aristocracy, he had enjoyed vast wealth, extensive leisure, and complete freedom from physical labour, all supported by the back-breaking toil of serfs who lived in conditions barely above subsistence. This experience gave him unique insight into both the psychological effects of extreme inequality and the elaborate ideological structures that the privileged classes created to justify their position. What struck Tolstoy most forcefully was the complete disconnection between the lifestyle of the rich and the actual sources of wealth and comfort they enjoyed. Aristocrats lived in magnificent houses, but had no idea how those houses were built or maintained. They ate elaborate meals, but had never grown, harvested or prepared food themselves. They wore fine clothes but had never spun thread, woven fabric or sewn garments. They surrounded themselves with beautiful objects but had never learned the skills required to create such beauty. In short, they were completely dependent on the labour of others for everything that made their lives comfortable and pleasant. Yet they contributed nothing productive in return. They were parasites who had convinced themselves that they deserved their privileged position because of their superior breeding, education, or cultural refinement. This parasitic relationship was not just economically exploitative, but morally devastating to both the exploiters and the exploited. The wealthy classes lost touch with the fundamental realities of human existence because they never had to engage directly with the natural world or with the practical challenges of survival. They developed elaborate artificial needs and sophisticated tastes that required enormous amounts of labour to satisfy but contributed nothing to genuine human welfare. They became obsessed with status, fashion and cultural competition because they had no meaningful work to occupy their time and energy. Most importantly, they lost their capacity for moral development because they were insulated from the consequences of their choices and had no experience of genuine hardship or sacrifice. Wealth and privilege were not rewards for virtue, but obstacles to achieving virtue. Meanwhile, the labouring classes were systematically prevented from developing their full human potential by the conditions imposed on them by economic necessity. They had to work such long hours just to survive that they had no time for education, cultural development, or spiritual growth. They were kept in ignorance deliberately because educated workers would be more likely to question the legitimacy of the system that exploited them. They were encouraged to find escape in alcohol, gambling, and other forms of self-destructive behaviour that provided temporary relief from their misery while ensuring that they remained trapped in their subordinate position. The same system that gave the rich too much leisure gave the poor too little, preventing both groups from achieving the balanced life that human flourishing required. Economic inequality was not just a distribution problem, but a barrier to the moral and spiritual development of the entire society. Tolstoy's critique extended beyond economic relationships to encompass the cultural and intellectual justifications that the privileged classes developed for their position. The art, literature, philosophy and even religion of his time were largely created by and for the wealthy, reflecting their values and interests while ignoring or misrepresenting the experiences of the majority of humanity. High culture became a form of class marker, a way of distinguishing the refined from the vulgar, rather than a means of expressing universal human truths. Education was designed to prepare people for their predetermined roles in the social hierarchy, rather than to develop their full potential as human beings. Even charity and philanthropy, which seemed to express concern for the poor, were actually ways of maintaining the system while alleviating the guilt of the privileged. By providing just enough assistance to prevent revolution, while leaving the fundamental structure of inequality unchanged, charitable activities allowed the rich to feel virtuous while continuing to benefit from exploitation. The solution that Tolstoy proposed was not political revolution, which would simply replace one set of exploiters with another, but a gradual transformation of consciousness that would make exploitation impossible. This required people in privileged positions to voluntarily renounce their advantages and to commit themselves to productive labour and simple living. It required those in subordinate positions to refuse to accept their exploitation and to demand the dignity and respect that all human beings deserved. Most importantly, it required everyone to recognise that true security and happiness could only be achieved when all people had access to the conditions necessary for human flourishing. No one could be truly free while others remained enslaved, and no one could be genuinely happy while others suffered from preventable deprivation. Social justice was not just a political goal, but a spiritual imperative, an expression of the fundamental unity that connected all human beings to each other and to the divine source of existence. Part 15. Personal transformation and self-perfection. Central to Tolstoy's entire philosophical system was the conviction that meaningful social change had to begin with individual transformation, that no external revolution could succeed without an internal revolution in consciousness and character. This was not the position of someone who was indifferent to social problems or who wanted to avoid political engagement, but the hard-won insight of someone who had tried many different approaches to improving the human condition and had discovered that lasting change required a different kind of work entirely. The project of self-perfection was not selfish navel-gazing, but the most practical thing anyone could do to make the world a better place. Tolstoy's understanding of personal transformation was based on his recognition that most human problems stemmed from false beliefs about the nature of the self and its relationship to others. People suffered because they identified themselves with their egos, their individual personalities, their social roles and their material possessions, all of which were temporary and ultimately illusory. They sought happiness through accumulating wealth, achieving status, dominating others, and satisfying desires, all of which led inevitably to frustration and disappointment, because they were based on the false premise that the individual self was separate from and in competition with the rest of existence. True happiness could only be found by recognizing the fundamental unity that connected all beings, and by aligning one's actions with this deeper reality rather than with the demands of the ego. This recognition was not primarily intellectual, but experiential, something that had to be lived rather than simply understood. It required a gradual process of letting go of attachments, fears and illusions that had been built up over a lifetime of conditioning. It required developing new habits of thought and action that expressed love rather than selfishness, truth rather than self-deception, and service rather than exploitation. Most importantly, it required the courage to face honestly the ways in which one's own life contributed to the suffering and injustice in the world, and the commitment to make whatever changes were necessary to align one's actions with one's highest understanding. Tolstoy's own journey of personal transformation was painful and often chaotic, involving dramatic changes in lifestyle, values and relationships that created considerable turmoil for himself and his family. He struggled with his own selfishness, pride and attachment to comfort and status. He made mistakes and experienced setbacks that forced him to confront the gap between his ideals and his actual behavior. He discovered that intellectual understanding of spiritual principles was very different from embodying those principles in daily life. But he also experienced the profound satisfaction that came from gradually freeing himself from illusions and learning to live with greater authenticity and purpose. Each step toward greater truth and love brought its own rewards, even when it also brought new challenges and difficulties. The process of self-perfection that Tolstoy advocated was not about becoming perfect in some absolute sense, which he recognized was impossible for human beings, but about making steady progress toward greater alignment with one's highest understanding of truth and morality. It was about becoming more conscious of one's thoughts, emotions and actions, and taking responsibility for their effects on others. It was about developing greater capacity for love, compassion and service, and less attachment to ego gratification and material accumulation. It was about learning to see through the illusions created by social conditioning and to respond to life from a place of wisdom rather than from automatic patterns of reaction. This work was never finished, because consciousness could always expand further, and love could always deepen. But each stage of development brought its own fulfillment and contributed to the overall evolution of human awareness. Tolstoy believed that personal transformation was contagious, that each person who committed themselves seriously to this work influenced everyone around them in subtle but powerful ways. When someone lived with genuine authenticity and love, others could sense it even if they could not articulate what they were sensing. This example challenged others to examine their own lives and to consider whether they too might be capable of greater truth and goodness. It created ripples of influence that spread far beyond what any individual could track or measure. Moreover, as more people engaged in this work of inner transformation, it became easier for others to follow suit, because the cultural environment became more supportive of authentic spiritual development. Personal transformation and social transformation were not separate processes, but different aspects of the same fundamental change in human consciousness. By working on themselves with sincere dedication, individuals were participating in the gradual awakening of humanity to its own divine nature and potential. Part 16. The Philosophy of Work and Labour. Tolstoy's understanding of work was fundamentally different from both the aristocratic view that manual labour was degrading and the capitalist view that work was primarily a means of generating profit. For him, productive labour was not just an economic necessity but a moral imperative and a spiritual practice, essential for human dignity and psychological health. His philosophy of work grew out of his own experience of transitioning from a life of leisure to one of physical labour, and his observation of how this change affected both his character and his understanding of existence itself. The foundation of Tolstoy's philosophy of work was his belief that human beings were meant to be productive creators rather than passive consumers. Every person had an obligation to contribute to meeting the basic needs of the human community through their own efforts. This was not just a matter of economic fairness, but of psychological and spiritual necessity. People who lived entirely off the labour of others became disconnected from the fundamental realities of existence and lost their capacity for genuine satisfaction and moral development. They might accumulate wealth and luxury, but they could never achieve the deep contentment that came from creating something useful with their own hands and contributing directly to human welfare. Work was not a curse, but a blessing, the means through which people connected with the creative forces of the universe and expressed their own divine nature. Tolstoy distinguished sharply between productive work, which created real value, and parasitic activity, which simply redistributed wealth created by others. Farming, craftsmanship, teaching, healing, and artistic creation were examples of productive work because they resulted in goods or services that actually improved human life. Financial speculation, rent collection, bureaucratic administration, and luxury production were examples of parasitic activity because they consumed resources without adding real value. The problem with modern civilization was that it had created vast systems that rewarded parasitic activity while devaluing productive work. People who grew food or made necessary objects were paid barely enough to survive, while people who manipulated money or managed property accumulated enormous wealth. This inverted value system not only created economic inequality, but also corrupted the moral understanding of the entire society. The spiritual dimension of work was particularly important to Tolstoy's philosophy. When people engaged in genuine productive labour, they participated directly in the creative processes that sustained life itself. The farmer who planted seeds was cooperating with the mysterious forces that transformed earth, water and sunlight into food. The craftsman who shaped wood or metal was channeling the same creative intelligence that formed mountains and rivers. The teacher who shared knowledge was participating in the evolution of consciousness itself. This kind of work was not just a way of earning money, but a form of prayer, a way of expressing gratitude for existence and contributing to the ongoing creation of the world. It connected people directly with the sources of life and reminded them of their dependence on forces far greater than their individual egos. Tolstoy also understood that work had crucial social and psychological functions beyond its economic role. Shared labour created bonds between people that could not be achieved through mere conversation or social interaction. When people worked together toward common goals, they developed mutual respect and understanding that transcended differences of class, education, or cultural background. Physical work also provided a healthy balance to intellectual activity, preventing the kind of mental imbalance that led to anxiety, depression, and existential crisis. People who spent their days thinking needed to also spend time working with their hands in order to maintain psychological health and stay connected to practical reality. Most importantly, productive work gave people a concrete sense of purpose and accomplishment that abstract philosophical or artistic pursuits often failed to provide. The ideal that Tolstoy proposed was a society in which everyone participated in productive labour according to their abilities, and everyone shared in the results according to their needs. This would not be imposed by government authority, but would emerge naturally when people understood their fundamental interdependence and learned to value contribution over accumulation. Such a society would not eliminate specialization or individual talents, but it would ensure that everyone had experience with basic productive activities and that no one lived entirely off the labor of others. It would also eliminate the artificial distinction between mental and physical work, recognizing that both were necessary for human flourishing and that the healthiest individuals and communities combined both types of activity. Work would no longer be something that people had to do in order to survive, but something they chose to do in order to express their creativity and contribute to the common good. This transformation would not happen overnight, but it could begin with individuals who chose to live according to these principles, even within existing economic structures. Part 17. Sexuality, Marriage, and Human Relationships. Perhaps no aspect of Tolstoy's philosophy was more controversial or personally challenging than his views on sexuality and marriage, which evolved from conventional acceptance of aristocratic marriage arrangements to an almost ascetic rejection of sexual desire as fundamentally incompatible with spiritual development. His thinking on these matters was deeply influenced by his own struggles with sexual passion, and his growing conviction that true love was spiritual rather than physical in nature. While his extreme positions on these topics were often rejected, even by his most devoted followers, they reflected his characteristic refusal to accept comfortable compromises when pursuing ultimate truth. Tolstoy's critique of conventional marriage began with his observation that most marriages in his social class were essentially economic and social arrangements rather than unions based on genuine love and spiritual compatibility. Young people were expected to marry within their class and to consider financial and social advantages rather than personal affinity or moral character. The institution of marriage as it existed served primarily to preserve and transfer property rather than to support human happiness and spiritual development. Women were treated as possessions to be acquired and controlled rather than as equal partners in a shared spiritual journey. Men were encouraged to think of marriage as a way of securing sexual access and domestic service, rather than as an opportunity for mutual growth and support. Such arrangements might create stable households and successful breeding programs, but they had little to do with love in any meaningful sense of the word. Even more troubling to Tolstoy was the role that sexual desire played in human relationships generally. He came to believe that sexual attraction was fundamentally selfish and possessive, based on the desire to use another person for one's own pleasure rather than to serve their highest good. Sexual relationships, even when they involved genuine affection, were still fundamentally about taking rather than giving, about satisfying one's own needs rather than transcending those needs in service of something higher. This made sexual love incompatible with the kind of universal love that Tolstoy believed was the goal of human development. As long as people were driven by sexual desire, they would prioritize their personal relationships over their obligations to humanity as a whole. They would create exclusive bonds that separated them from others rather than inclusive bonds that connected them to everyone. Tolstoy's most extreme position, articulated in works like the Kreutzer Sonata, was that sexual activity was inherently degrading and that the highest human ideal was complete celibacy. He argued that sexual desire was a remnant of humanity's animal nature that needed to be transcended rather than indulged. People who were still driven by physical passion were not yet fully human in the spiritual sense, regardless of their intellectual sophistication or cultural refinement. True spiritual development required the sublimation of sexual energy into higher forms of love and creativity. This was not repression or denial, but transformation, the channeling of life force toward purposes that served the universal good rather than individual gratification. Saints and sages throughout history had recognized this truth, which was why so many spiritual traditions emphasized celibacy as an ideal. These views created enormous tension in Tolstoy's personal life, particularly in his relationship with his wife Sophia, who had not chosen to embrace such extreme asceticism. Their marriage became a battleground between his evolving spiritual ideals and the practical realities of family life. He felt guilty about his continued sexual relationship with his wife, while she felt rejected and abandoned by his growing emphasis on spiritual rather than physical intimacy. Their conflicts over these issues contributed to the deteriorating relationship that ultimately led to his dramatic departure from home shortly before his death. The tragedy of Tolstoy's personal life illustrated the difficulty of applying abstract spiritual principles to the complex realities of human relationships. His inability to find a satisfactory balance between his ideals and his circumstances became a source of suffering for himself and his family. Despite the extremism of some of his positions, Tolstoy's exploration of sexuality and relationships raised important questions about the connection between physical desire and spiritual development. He recognized that sexual relationships could become obsessive and destructive when they were not balanced by other forms of love and purpose. He saw that exclusive romantic attachments could indeed interfere with the development of universal compassion if they became too self-absorbed and possessive. He understood that the energy involved in sexual attraction was potentially available for other purposes if it could be consciously redirected. While few people were prepared to accept his most radical conclusions, many could benefit from his insights about the need to integrate physical, emotional and spiritual dimensions of love in conscious and intentional ways. His struggle with these issues reflected the broader challenge of living according to spiritual principles in a world that was still largely governed by biological and social imperatives. Part 18. The Understanding of Suffering. Tolstoy's philosophy of suffering was shaped by his acute awareness that existence seemed to contain an overwhelming amount of pain, injustice and loss that appeared to serve no obvious purpose. Unlike philosophers who tried to explain suffering away or minimize its significance, Tolstoy confronted it directly as one of the central facts of human existence that any honest worldview had to address. His understanding of suffering evolved from seeing it as evidence of life's meaninglessness to recognizing it as an essential element in spiritual development and moral awakening. In his early spiritual crisis, Tolstoy had been overwhelmed by the apparent senselessness of human suffering. Children died of diseases they had done nothing to deserve. Good people faced poverty and persecution, while evil people prospered. Natural disasters destroyed communities without regard for the moral character of their inhabitants. Wars killed millions of young men who had no voice in the political decisions that led to conflict. From a rational perspective, the distribution of suffering seemed completely random and unjust, which made it impossible to believe in a benevolent universe or a loving God. If existence was governed by moral principles, why did virtue so often go unrewarded, while vice was frequently successful? The prevalence of undeserved suffering seemed to prove that the universe was either amoral or actively malevolent. But Tolstoy's deeper exploration of spiritual questions led him to a radically different understanding of suffering's role in human development. He began to see that suffering often served as a teacher, forcing people to question assumptions and priorities that might otherwise go unexamined. Comfortable people rarely engaged in serious soul-searching, while those who faced hardship were compelled to ask fundamental questions about the meaning and purpose of existence. Suffering stripped away illusions about what was truly important, revealing the difference between genuine needs and artificial wants. It broke down the barriers of ego and selfishness that separated people from each other, creating empathy and compassion that prosperity often failed to develop. Most importantly, it forced people to look beyond material circumstances for sources of meaning and happiness that could not be destroyed by external events. Tolstoy came to distinguish between different types of suffering and their various functions in human development. Some suffering was clearly unnecessary and resulted from human ignorance, selfishness, and injustice. Poverty caused by economic exploitation, violence resulting from hatred and fear, and illness stemming from unhealthy living conditions were examples of suffering that could and should be eliminated through better understanding and more compassionate action. But other forms of suffering seemed to be inherent in the human condition and served important purposes that were not immediately obvious. The grief that followed the death of loved ones, the frustration that arose from the gap between ideals and reality, and the loneliness that came from feeling misunderstood were examples of suffering that might be unavoidable, but that also contributed to psychological and spiritual maturation. Such suffering was not a design flaw in existence, but an essential element in the process through which consciousness evolved toward greater wisdom and compassion. The key insight that transformed Tolstoy's relationship to suffering was his recognition that its meaning depended largely on how people responded to it. Suffering could either embitter and destroy people, or it could refine and strengthen them, depending on their attitude and understanding. Those who responded to hardship with hatred, resentment, and self-pity often became worse rather than better through their trials. But those who accepted suffering as an opportunity for learning and growth often emerged from their difficulties with greater depth, wisdom, and capacity for love. The same external circumstances could produce completely different internal results depending on the consciousness that encountered them. This meant that people had much more control over their experience than was commonly recognized, not by avoiding suffering, but by transforming their relationship to it. Tolstoy's mature philosophy of suffering was closely connected to his understanding of spiritual development and moral evolution. He believed that consciousness naturally sought greater truth, love, and unity, but that this evolution required the breakdown of false beliefs and selfish attachments that people clung to for security. Suffering was often the force that accomplished this breakdown, forcing people to let go of illusions that no longer served them and to open themselves to higher possibilities. From this perspective, even apparently meaningless suffering could serve a cosmic purpose by contributing to the overall evolution of consciousness toward greater awareness and compassion. This did not mean that people should seek out suffering or fail to work toward eliminating unnecessary pain and injustice, but it did mean that suffering, when it came, could be received as a teacher rather than simply endured as a punishment, and that its lessons could contribute to both individual development and the gradual transformation of human society as a whole. Part 19. Women, Gender and Human Equality. Tolstoy's views on women and gender reflected both the progressive insights of his spiritual philosophy and the limitations of his 19th century cultural background, creating a complex and often contradictory set of positions that evolved significantly over the course of his life. While his commitment to universal human equality logically implied the full dignity and rights of women, his practical application of these principles was often inconsistent and influenced by conventional assumptions about gender roles and biological differences. His struggle with these issues revealed the difficulty of transcending deeply ingrained social conditioning, even when one's philosophical principles pointed toward more egalitarian conclusions. The foundation of Tolstoy's thinking about women was his belief that all human beings possessed the same divine essence, and therefore deserved equal respect and consideration. This principle clearly contradicted the legal and social subordination of women that characterized Russian society in his time. Women had few legal rights, limited educational opportunities, and were generally expected to define themselves primarily in relation to their roles as wives and mothers. They were excluded from most professions and public activities, and were treated as the property of their fathers and husbands, rather than as autonomous individuals. From the perspective of Tolstoy's spiritual philosophy, such arrangements were clearly unjust because they denied the fundamental equality and dignity that belonged to all human beings regardless of their biological characteristics. Just as economic class or national origin could not justify treating some people as inferior to others, gender differences could not legitimately be used to deny women their basic human rights. Tolstoy was particularly critical of the way that society encouraged women to focus on their physical appearance and social accomplishments rather than on their intellectual and moral development. The education provided to women of his class emphasized music, languages, and social graces, while neglecting serious study of philosophy, science, and other subjects that might develop their rational and critical faculties. Women were taught to see themselves primarily as objects of male desire and to compete with each other for the attention and approval of men, rather than to pursue their own interests and develop their own capabilities. This system not only wasted enormous human potential, but also corrupted both women and men by reducing relationships to matters of acquisition and display rather than genuine partnership and mutual growth. Society needed the full participation of all its members to address its problems and achieve its potential, but it systematically prevented half the population from contributing their talents and perspectives. This was not just unfair to women, but harmful to everyone, because it deprived society of the wisdom and creativity that women could provide. However, Tolstoy's application of these egalitarian principles was complicated by his beliefs about biological differences between men and women and their implications for social organization. He tended to accept conventional assumptions about women's supposedly greater emotional sensitivity, their natural affinity for domestic activities, and their primary responsibility for child-rearing. While he opposed legal and social discrimination against women, he still believed that they were naturally suited for somewhat different roles than men, and that these differences should be respected rather than ignored. This led him to support education and opportunities for women, while still maintaining that their highest calling was motherhood, and that their primary sphere of influence should be the family rather than public life. He failed to recognize how much of what he attributed to female nature might actually have been the result of social conditioning and limited opportunities. His own relationship with his wife reflected these tensions, as he expected her to support his spiritual and intellectual pursuits, while assuming that her own aspirations should be subordinated to his and to their family's needs. The evolution of Tolstoy's thinking about women can be seen in his literary works, which gradually developed more complex and sympathetic female characters who struggled with the constraints imposed on them by society. Anna Karenina, for example, was portrayed not simply as a fallen woman who deserved her fate, but as a complex individual trapped by social expectations and limited options who deserved compassion rather than condemnation. Tolstoy's later works showed increasing awareness of how women's lives were constrained by economic dependence, legal subordination, and social expectations that prevented them from developing their full potential. He began to understand that the liberation of women was not just a matter of justice for women themselves, but was essential for the moral development of society as a whole. Men could not become fully human while they were oppressing and limiting the women in their lives, and society could not achieve its potential while it was wasting the talents and perspectives of half its members. The struggle for human equality had to include gender equality, or it would remain incomplete and ultimately unsuccessful. Despite the limitations and inconsistencies in Tolstoy's thinking about women, his basic philosophical principles provided a foundation for more complete gender equality than he himself always recognized or applied. His emphasis on the fundamental spiritual equality of all beings, his critique of social hierarchies based on birth or circumstance, and his insistence that every individual had the right and responsibility to develop their full human potential all pointed toward the need for complete equality of opportunity, regardless of gender. His recognition that true love was spiritual rather than physical suggested that relationships between men and women should be based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than on domination and subordination. His understanding that social transformation required individual moral development implied that both men and women needed to evolve beyond the limiting roles that tradition had assigned to them. While Tolstoy himself did not always live up to the implications of his own philosophy, his fundamental insights about human nature and moral development provided tools that others could use to work toward the complete realization of human equality in all its dimensions. Part 20. The Kingdom of God Within. The concept that would become central to Tolstoy's entire spiritual philosophy was his understanding of the Kingdom of God Within, a phrase from Jesus' teachings that he interpreted not as a reference to life after death, but as a description of a transformed state of consciousness available to everyone in the present moment. This inner kingdom was not a place but a way of being, characterized by love, peace and unity with the divine source of existence. For Tolstoy, the realization of this inner kingdom was both the goal of individual spiritual development and the key to transforming human society as a whole. Tolstoy's interpretation of the kingdom of God was radically different from the conventional Christian understanding of his time, which typically portrayed it as a reward that believers would receive in heaven after death. He argued that Jesus had been quite explicit about the kingdom being within people and among them in the present rather than in some future state of existence. This kingdom was not something that people had to wait for or earn through good behavior, but something they could access immediately by changing their consciousness and their way of relating to others. It was not dependent on external circumstances or institutional mediation, but was available to anyone who was willing to let go of selfish desires and open themselves to the love that connected all beings. The kingdom of God was simply what human life looked like when it was lived according to its true nature rather than according to the illusions created by fear, greed and separation. It was paradise regained through the recovery of innocence and the recognition of unity. The key to entering this kingdom was what Tolstoy called the transformation of consciousness, from ego-based thinking to love-based thinking. Most people lived their lives from the perspective of a separate self that was in competition with other separate selves for scarce resources and limited happiness. This perspective created constant anxiety, conflict, and dissatisfaction because it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. The truth was that all beings were part of a larger whole, and that individual welfare was inseparable from universal welfare. When people recognized this truth, not just intellectually but experientially, their entire relationship to life transformed. They stopped trying to get happiness from others and started giving happiness to others. They stopped fearing death because they realized that their true identity transcended individual existence. They stopped competing with others because they understood that everyone's success contributed to their own well-being. Living in the kingdom of God required specific practices and attitudes that Tolstoy outlined in great detail throughout his spiritual writings. It meant treating every person as a brother or sister, regardless of their social status, nationality, or personal character. It meant responding to hatred with love, to violence with non-resistance, and to injury with forgiveness. It meant sharing resources freely with those in need and working not for personal advancement, but for the common good. It meant being truthful in all circumstances, even when truth was inconvenient or dangerous. It meant living simply and being content with basic necessities rather than constantly seeking more comfort and luxury. Most importantly, it meant recognizing the divine presence in every moment and every encounter, treating ordinary life as sacred rather than looking for holiness only in special times and places. These were not rules imposed from outside, but natural expressions of the transformed consciousness that characterized life in the kingdom. Tolstoy believed that individuals who lived in this way would naturally create communities that reflected the same principles, and that such communities would gradually spread until they transformed the entire human society. The kingdom of God was not just a personal spiritual achievement, but the ultimate destiny of human civilization. As more people learned to live according to love rather than fear, the institutions based on violence and exploitation would become obsolete and would be replaced by forms of organization based on cooperation and mutual care. This transformation would not require political revolution or external force, but would emerge naturally as consciousness evolved toward greater wisdom and compassion. The kingdom of God was both fully present in the consciousness of awakened individuals and still in the process of being realized collectively throughout human history. It was the alpha and omega of spiritual development, the source from which consciousness emerged and the goal toward which it was naturally evolving. The practical implications of this vision were enormous for how Tolstoy thought people should live their daily lives. If the kingdom of God was available in the present moment, then there was no need to postpone happiness or meaning until some future time when conditions might be more favorable. People could begin immediately to live according to the principles of love and truth, regardless of how others around them were living. They could create pockets of the kingdom wherever they were, in their families, their work, and their communities. Each person who chose to live this way was contributing to the eventual transformation of the entire world, and was also experiencing the peace and joy that came from alignment with ultimate reality. The kingdom of God was not a utopian dream, but a practical possibility that could be realized by anyone who was willing to make the necessary inner changes and to live courageously according to their highest understanding of truth and love. Part 21. Truth, Knowledge and Reality. Tolstoy's epistemology, his theory of how human beings can know truth, was fundamentally shaped by his conviction that the most important truths about existence could not be discovered through rational analysis alone, but required a different kind of knowing that engaged the whole person, heart as well as mind. This was not anti-intellectual obscurantism, but a carefully reasoned conclusion based on his observation that purely rational approaches to ultimate questions led inevitably to skepticism and despair. He developed a sophisticated understanding of the different types of knowledge and their appropriate domains, arguing for the complementary rather than conflicting relationship between reason and faith. The foundation of Tolstoy's theory of knowledge was his distinction between scientific truth and spiritual truth, each of which required different methods of investigation and served different purposes in human life. Scientific truth dealt with the measurable, quantifiable aspects of reality and could be verified through experiment, observation, and logical analysis. This type of knowledge was extremely valuable for understanding how the physical world operated and for developing technologies that could improve material conditions. But it could tell you nothing about why the world existed, what made life worth living, or how people should treat each other. These questions belonged to the realm of spiritual truth, which could only be accessed through moral intuition, spiritual experience, and what Tolstoy called the reason of the heart. Attempting to use scientific methods to answer spiritual questions was like trying to measure love with a ruler or weigh hope on a scale, a category error that led to meaningless results. Tolstoy argued that spiritual truth was not less reliable than scientific truth, but was reliable in a different way. When people had direct experience of love, beauty, or moral obligation, they knew these realities with a certainty that was not dependent on external verification. A mother did not need scientific proof that she loved her child because the love was immediately present in her consciousness. A person witnessing injustice did not need philosophical arguments to know that it was wrong, because moral perception was as direct and reliable as sensory perception. The problem arose when people tried to translate these direct experiences into abstract propositions that could be debated and analyzed like scientific hypotheses. Spiritual truth could be lived and shared, but could not be proven in the way that mathematical theorems could be proven. This did not make it less real, but simply meant that it belonged to a different category of reality than the objects studied by physical science. The integration of these different types of knowledge was crucial for Tolstoy's understanding of how human beings should approach the fundamental questions of existence. Reason was an excellent tool for analyzing information, solving practical problems, and organizing experience in coherent ways. But it was not equipped to provide the foundational meanings and values that gave direction to rational analysis. These had to come from spiritual insight, from the direct recognition of what was truly important and valuable in existence. Once these foundational insights were established through spiritual experience, reason could then work out their implications and applications in specific circumstances. Faith provided the vision, while reason provided the map for realizing that vision in practical terms. Neither was sufficient by itself, but together they could address the full range of human concerns and provide guidance for living a meaningful and effective life. Tolstoy's approach to truth was also characterized by his conviction that knowledge had to be tested through lived experience rather than simply accepted on intellectual grounds. He was deeply skeptical of purely theoretical knowledge that had no practical consequences for how people actually lived their lives. The value of any idea or belief system could only be determined by examining its effects on character, relationships, and overall human flourishing. Truth was not just a matter of having correct beliefs, but of embodying those beliefs in daily action and experiencing their results. This pragmatic test of truth meant that spiritual insights had to be verified through moral and spiritual practice, while scientific theories had to be verified through experiment and application. Knowledge that remained purely abstract, whether scientific or spiritual, was incomplete and potentially dangerous because it had not been integrated with the realities of human existence. The ultimate goal of knowledge, in Tolstoy's view, was not to satisfy intellectual curiosity, but to enable people to live more fully and to contribute more effectively to the well-being of others. Truth was not a possession to be accumulated, but a way of being that had to be constantly renewed and deepened through practice. The most important knowledge was self-knowledge, the understanding of one's own nature, motivations, and relationship to the larger whole of existence. This knowledge could not be gained through introspection alone, but required engagement with others and with the practical challenges of daily life. People discovered who they truly were by testing themselves against reality, by acting on their beliefs and observing the consequences, and by gradually aligning their understanding with their experience. The pursuit of truth was therefore not an intellectual exercise, but a way of life that required courage, honesty, and commitment to growth and service. Part 22. Prayer, Meditation and Spiritual Practice. Tolstoy's approach to spiritual practice was characterized by his rejection of formal religious rituals in favor of what he considered more authentic and direct methods of connecting with the divine source of existence. He was deeply suspicious of elaborate ceremonial practices that seemed to emphasize external forms rather than internal transformation, but he was equally committed to the need for regular spiritual discipline that could support ongoing moral and spiritual development. His own practice evolved over time from conventional orthodox observances to a highly personal and philosophical approach that emphasized prayer, study, and ethical reflection. The foundation of Tolstoy's spiritual practice was his understanding of prayer not as petitioning God for favors, but as a way of aligning human consciousness with divine consciousness. He rejected prayers that asked for material benefits, victory over enemies, or special treatment, seeing these as expressions of selfishness that contradicted the spirit of genuine spirituality. True prayer was not about getting God to change external circumstances, but about changing one's own heart and mind to be more receptive to divine influence. It was a way of remembering what was truly important, of reconnecting with the larger purposes that transcended individual concerns, and of opening oneself to the love and wisdom that were always available, but often blocked by ego and distraction. Prayer was less like making requests and more like tuning an instrument, bringing human consciousness into harmony with the fundamental frequencies of existence. The goal was not to influence God, but to be influenced by God, not to change the world, but to be changed by recognizing one's place in the larger whole. Tolstoy's daily spiritual practice included regular periods of reflection and self-examination, during which he would review his thoughts, actions and motivations in light of his highest understanding of truth and morality. This was not morbid self-criticism, but honest assessment designed to support ongoing growth and development. He would ask himself whether his actions had been motivated by love or by selfishness, whether his thoughts had been truthful or self-serving, and whether his interactions with others had contributed to their well-being or had served only his own interests. This practice of moral inventory was essential for maintaining the kind of self-awareness that spiritual development required. Without regular honest reflection, it was easy to deceive oneself about one's motivations and to drift away from one's highest intentions without realizing it. The practice of self-examination served as a corrective mechanism that helped keep behavior aligned with values and maintained the momentum of spiritual growth. Another crucial element of Tolstoy's spiritual practice was his extensive study of religious and philosophical texts from various traditions around the world. He read not just Christian scriptures, but also Buddhist texts, Hindu scriptures, Islamic writings, and the works of moral philosophers from many cultures and historical periods. This was not academic study for its own sake, but a search for universal principles and practical wisdom that could guide his own development and help him understand the common ground that united all authentic spiritual traditions. He compiled anthologies of wisdom sayings and moral teachings that he used for daily meditation and reflection. This study served multiple purposes. It exposed him to insights and perspectives that he might not have discovered on his own. It helped him distinguish between universal spiritual principles and culturally specific practices, and it provided inspiration and guidance for his own spiritual journey. The goal was not to become a scholar, but to become a better human being through exposure to the accumulated wisdom of humanity. Tolstoy also emphasized the importance of what might be called practical spiritual exercises, activities that helped translate spiritual insights into concrete changes in behavior and character. These included deliberate acts of service to others, especially to those who were less fortunate or who had treated him badly. They included experiments in simple living, efforts to reduce his dependence on luxury and comfort in order to develop greater appreciation for basic necessities and greater empathy for those who lacked such necessities. They included practices of forgiveness and reconciliation, deliberate efforts to heal broken relationships and to let go of resentments and grievances. These exercises were not mechanical or ritualistic, but were creative responses to specific circumstances and challenges, ways of applying spiritual principles to the practical realities of daily life. The goal was to make spirituality practical and to make practical life spiritual, eliminating the artificial separation between religious observance and ordinary activity. The ultimate purpose of all these practices was to support what Tolstoy called conscious living, a state of awareness in which every moment was approached as an opportunity for moral and spiritual growth. This did not mean being solemn or self-conscious all the time, but rather being present and intentional in whatever one was doing. It meant treating every encounter with another person as sacred, every decision as morally significant, and every experience as a potential teacher. This kind of consciousness could not be maintained through willpower alone, but required the support of regular practices that strengthened awareness and renewed commitment to growth and service. Spiritual practice was not separate from ordinary life, but was the foundation that made it possible to live ordinary life with extraordinary depth and meaning. The goal was not to escape from the world, but to transform one's relationship to the world, seeing it as a place for learning and service, rather than as a source of pleasure or a threat to be defended against. Part 23. Universal Brotherhood and World Unity. The ultimate vision that emerged from Tolstoy's philosophical journey was the possibility of universal human brotherhood, a state of global civilization in which all people recognized their fundamental unity and organized their societies according to principles of love, justice, and mutual care. This was not utopian dreaming, but what he saw as the inevitable destination of human moral evolution, the logical conclusion of the spiritual development that was already taking place among individuals around the world. His vision of world unity was based not on political or economic integration, but on the transformation of consciousness that would make such integration both possible and unnecessary. Tolstoy's understanding of universal brotherhood grew out of his conviction that the apparent divisions between human beings were artificial constructions that obscured their deeper unity. Differences of nationality, race, religion, and social class were real at one level, but were ultimately superficial compared to the common humanity that all people shared. Every person had the same basic needs for food, shelter, love, and meaning. Every person possessed the same capacity for reason, moral development, and spiritual growth. Every person was part of the same cosmic process of consciousness, evolving toward greater awareness and compassion. The barriers that separated people from each other were maintained by ignorance, fear, and selfish interests, rather than by genuine differences in nature or destiny. When these barriers were dissolved through education and spiritual development, the natural unity of humanity would become apparent and would serve as the foundation for new forms of social organization. The path toward universal brotherhood required the gradual elimination of the institutions and ideologies that perpetuated division and conflict among human beings. Nationalism, which taught people to identify primarily with their country rather than with humanity as a whole, would need to be transcended. Religious sectarianism, which claimed exclusive access to divine truth for particular groups, would need to give way to recognition of the universal principles that united all authentic spiritual traditions. Economic systems based on competition and exploitation would need to be replaced by arrangements based on cooperation and mutual aid. Legal systems based on punishment and coercion would need to evolve toward approaches based on education and rehabilitation. Most fundamentally, the entire mindset of us versus them, which saw human differences as grounds for conflict rather than opportunities for learning and enrichment, would need to be replaced by a mindset of universal inclusion and care. Tolstoy believed that this transformation was already beginning to occur through the work of individuals and communities around the world who were committed to living according to universal rather than tribal principles. Every person who chose love over hatred, truth over propaganda, and service over selfishness was contributing to the gradual emergence of a new form of human civilization. This work was often invisible and unrecognized, but it was creating the foundation for more visible changes that would eventually transform political and economic structures. The kingdom of God was being built from the bottom up through the patient work of countless individuals who were learning to see beyond the artificial divisions that had historically separated human beings from each other. This was slow work that might take generations or centuries to complete, but it was also the only work that could create lasting peace and justice rather than merely temporary truces between competing groups. Universal brotherhood could not be imposed by force or legislation, but had to grow naturally from the soil of transformed human consciousness. The practical implications of Tolstoy's vision of world unity were enormous for how he thought people should approach contemporary problems and challenges. Instead of focusing on national interests, people should consider the welfare of all humanity when making decisions about resource use, environmental protection, and technological development. Instead of supporting their own government, right or wrong, they should evaluate all political actions according to universal moral principles and oppose injustice regardless of which side was perpetrating it. Instead of competing with other nations or groups for advantage, they should look for ways to share knowledge, resources, and opportunities that would benefit everyone. Instead of maintaining exclusive loyalties to particular communities, they should see themselves as citizens of the world with responsibilities to all people everywhere. This did not mean abandoning all local attachments or cultural identities, but holding them within a larger framework of universal care and concern. Tolstoy understood that the realization of universal brotherhood would not eliminate all problems or create a perfect world, but it would transform the nature of human challenges from conflicts between groups to shared efforts to address common problems. Instead of wasting energy and resources on warfare and competition, humanity could focus its collective intelligence and creativity on solving problems like poverty, disease, environmental degradation, and ignorance that affected everyone. Instead of living in fear of each other, people could live in confidence that their welfare was connected to the welfare of others, and that cooperation was more rational than competition. Instead of seeking meaning through domination and acquisition, they could find fulfillment through contribution and service to the common good. The world that would emerge from universal brotherhood would still contain suffering and limitation, but it would also contain the kind of love, wisdom and solidarity that could address any challenge that arose. This was not the end of history, but the beginning of truly human history, the phase of civilization in which humanity would finally learn to live according to its highest nature and potential. Part 24. The Influence on Future Generations. The true measure of Tolstoy's philosophical legacy lies not in academic recognition, but in the practical influence his ideas had on subsequent generations of activists, thinkers, and spiritual seekers around the world. His writings provided both inspiration and concrete guidance for people who were working to create more just and peaceful societies, offering a comprehensive alternative to both the status quo and to revolutionary movements based on violence. The depth and breadth of his influence demonstrates the universal relevance of his insights and their continued importance for addressing contemporary challenges. Perhaps the most famous example of Tolstoy's influence was his impact on Mahatma Gandhi, who explicitly credited the Russian writer with providing the philosophical foundation for his approach to non-violent resistance. Gandhi read "The Kingdom of God is Within You" while working as a lawyer in South Africa, and found in it the theoretical framework that he had been seeking for his practical experiments with civil disobedience. Tolstoy's argument that true Christianity required absolute non-violence gave Gandhi the confidence to develop his own synthesis of Hindu, Christian and secular principles that would eventually lead to Indian independence and inspire civil rights movements around the world. The correspondence between Gandhi and Tolstoy during the final years of the latter's life shows the direct transmission of ideas from the Russian thinker to the Indian activist who would become one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. But Tolstoy's influence extended far beyond Gandhi to encompass a wide range of social movements and individual activists who found in his writings both moral inspiration and practical guidance. Martin Luther King Jr. and the American Civil Rights Movement drew heavily on Tolstoyan principles of nonviolent resistance and universal love. Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement found in Tolstoy's critique of wealth and his commitment to voluntary poverty a model for their own work with the homeless and marginalized. Peace activists during both World Wars cited Tolstoy's writings in defense of conscientious objection and alternative service. Environmental activists have found in his critique of industrialism and his advocacy of simple living a prescient analysis of ecological problems and their solutions. Even political radicals who rejected his pacifism often appreciated his analysis of economic inequality and his vision of a society based on cooperation rather than competition. Tolstoy's influence on literature and philosophy was equally significant, though often less visible than his impact on social movements. Writers like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf and Thomas Mann acknowledged his influence on their understanding of the relationship between art and morality. Philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein carried copies of Tolstoy's spiritual writings with them and credited the Russian thinker with helping them understand the limits of rational analysis in addressing ultimate questions. Psychologists and educators found in his writings insights about human development and learning that anticipated many later discoveries about motivation, creativity, and moral development. His integration of Eastern and Western spiritual traditions helped prepare the ground for the global spiritual movements that would emerge in the later 20th century. Even critics who disagreed with his conclusions often acknowledged the power of his questions and the depth of his commitment to finding authentic answers. Perhaps most importantly, Tolstoy's influence operated at the level of individual transformation, inspiring countless people to examine their own lives and to make changes that aligned their actions more closely with their deepest values and convictions. His example of someone who was willing to sacrifice comfort, status and social approval in pursuit of truth and authenticity provided a model for people who felt trapped by social expectations and conventional success. His demonstration that it was possible to find meaning and purpose through service to others, rather than through personal achievement, offered an alternative to the competitive individualism that dominated modern culture. His insistence that spiritual development required practical action as well as inner work challenged people to move beyond mere belief or sentiment to embodied commitment and service. The letters and memoirs of people who encountered his writings often describe profound personal transformations that led to new careers, changed relationships, and redirected life purposes. This kind of individual influence was impossible to measure statistically, but was perhaps more important than any institutional impact because it operated at the level where real change always begins, in the human heart and consciousness. The continued relevance of Tolstoy's ideas in the contemporary world suggests that his influence will extend far into the future as new generations discover his writings and find in them resources for addressing problems that remain unresolved. His analysis of the relationship between violence and injustice speaks directly to current debates about war, terrorism, and social conflict. His critique of materialism and his advocacy of simple living provide guidance for people concerned about environmental sustainability and spiritual fulfillment in a consumer culture. His vision of universal brotherhood offers an alternative to the nationalism and tribalism that continue to divide human communities. His integration of reason and faith provides a model for people seeking to maintain both intellectual integrity and spiritual depth in an age of scientific materialism and religious fundamentalism. Most fundamentally, his demonstration that individual moral development is both possible and necessary for social transformation offers hope for people who feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of contemporary problems, but who are committed to being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Part 25. The Final Synthesis and Enduring Legacy. As we reach the end of this exploration of Tolstoy's philosophical system, what emerges is not just a collection of ideas, but a coherent vision of human possibility that integrates insights about individual development, social organization, and cosmic purpose into a unified understanding of what it means to live a fully human life. Tolstoy's greatest achievement was not any single insight, but his demonstration that it was possible to create a world view that was simultaneously rational and spiritual, practical and idealistic, rooted in tradition and radically innovative. His philosophy offers both a diagnosis of what has gone wrong with human civilization and a prescription for how it might be healed. The central thread that runs through every aspect of Tolstoy's thought is his conviction that human beings are fundamentally spiritual beings who have lost touch with their true nature and purpose. All the problems that plague individuals and societies, from existential meaninglessness to economic inequality to international warfare, stem from this fundamental disconnection from the divine source of existence. People suffer because they identify themselves with their egos rather than with their deeper spiritual essence. Societies are unjust because they are organized around competition and domination rather than around cooperation and love. Institutions become corrupt because they serve particular interests rather than universal welfare. Civilization itself becomes destructive because it loses sight of its proper purpose, which is to support human flourishing rather than to accumulate power and wealth. The solution to all these problems is the same: the recovery of spiritual consciousness and its practical application to every aspect of human life. What makes Tolstoy's vision compelling is not just its moral beauty, but its practical feasibility. He demonstrated through his own life and work that it was possible for individuals to undergo fundamental transformation and to live according to principles that seemed impossible from a conventional perspective. His experiments with simple living, non-violent resistance, and universal love showed that these were not mere ideals, but workable approaches to real problems. His influence on subsequent generations of activists and reformers proved that such individual transformations could have far-reaching social consequences. His integration of Eastern and Western wisdom traditions showed that it was possible to develop a truly universal philosophy that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. Most importantly, his willingness to risk everything in pursuit of truth and authenticity demonstrated that human beings were capable of far greater moral courage and spiritual development than most people believed possible. The enduring relevance of Tolstoy's philosophy lies in its ability to address problems that remain as pressing today as they were in his time. The existential crisis that he experienced in his 50s is still the hidden condition of millions of people who have achieved conventional success but have failed to find meaning and purpose in their lives. The economic inequality that he critiqued has only grown more extreme in the centuries since his death. The violence that he opposed has become more sophisticated and destructive, but no less prevalent. The environmental degradation that he anticipated has become one of the greatest challenges facing human civilization. The spiritual emptiness that he diagnosed has become even more widespread in a culture that offers unprecedented material comfort but little guidance for inner development. In all these areas, Tolstoy's insights provide both analysis and alternatives that remain as relevant and challenging today as they were when he first articulated them. Perhaps most importantly, Tolstoy's legacy lies in his demonstration that philosophy is not an academic exercise but a way of life that requires courage, commitment, and practical application. He showed that the most important questions are also the most personal questions, and that answering them requires not just thinking but acting, not just believing but being. His example challenges each person to examine their own life and to ask whether they are living according to their highest understanding of truth and morality. It challenges societies to evaluate their institutions and practices according to whether they support human flourishing or merely perpetuate existing power relationships. It challenges civilization itself to consider whether its current trajectory is leading toward greater wisdom and compassion or toward greater destruction and alienation. These challenges are no easier to face today than they were in Tolstoy's time, but they remain as necessary and urgent as ever. The ultimate message of Tolstoy's philosophy is one of hope, grounded in realism. He offers no easy solutions or quick fixes, but demonstrates that fundamental transformation is possible for individuals who are willing to do the inner work that such transformation requires. He shows that societies can evolve toward greater justice and peace, but only through the patient efforts of people who are committed to embodying these values in their own lives. He proves that human consciousness can expand beyond the narrow confines of ego and self-interest to embrace universal love and concern, but only through the kind of spiritual discipline and moral courage that few people are willing to undertake. His life and work stand as permanent testimony to the possibility of human greatness, not in the sense of worldly achievement, but in the sense of moral and spiritual development that transforms not only the individual, but everyone they touch. In a world that often seems dominated by hatred, violence, and despair, Tolstoy's philosophy offers the radical proposition that love is stronger than fear, that truth is more powerful than illusion, and that the divine spark in human nature is ultimately inextinguishable. This is his greatest gift to future generations, not a system of beliefs to be accepted, but a challenge to live more fully and to contribute more effectively to the ongoing creation of a more just and peaceful world.